there's two things that I wanted to touch base on. One was that fireside chat that you and Michael Halleck had at the, I want to say the last German CLL group meeting. I was impressed by the way you started off. You started off with a picture of your mother and father's wedding, I believe, and then and went from there. I was when I was working on the David Galton, Dr. Galton was awarded in London, I forget the year, posthumously, and so I was working with his two brothers and his wife, and one of the photographs that was sent to me was him as a little boy. So that was as far back in his history. So I, for whatever reasons, that historical touch appeals to me. And the other thing was, I was amazed at the way you were able to trace the history of the evolution of BCL2 and the discovery of inhibitors and venetoclax. If you would review some of that again, please.
Okay. Maybe perhaps beginning from my parents, because in many ways I think my involvement in medicine, or the opportunity to be in medicine, is a very, very happy accident. Certainly not anything I ever took for granted or presumed, or in early life even had awareness of or aimed for. So the reason I spoke of that is that no one in my family's history had ever been to university. So a university education was something both of my parents strongly encouraged me for, but was something foreign to them, but it was aspirational. And that's encouragement, or that spirit of seeing that there were opportunities, was really sort of enabled my interest in medicine, because through my childhood, that wasn't a profession that we had any awareness of, contact with, real understanding of what that professional life meant. So I've been if you like, a welcome stranger in that sphere. My interest or exposure around BCL2, like really much of the origins of many of the things in my CLL career, really was stimulated by time in Houston, directly and indirectly. So the direct elements were, I was exposed to some of the work that Bud Robertson was doing under Michael Keating around looking at BCL2 expression within CLL, and that's during times when I was visiting and then in fellowship at MD Anderson. But the broader context of that was being in Houston, being in such an academic, intellectual environment. The visiting speakers, the rapidity of information exchange, the energy and enthusiasm was incredibly stimulating for me, and that almost that visceral feeling of excitement is still very intense around recollection of walking into MD Anderson. And many visiting speakers, and I can remember in particular John Reed from San Diego, who'd done much of the preclinical work. So after BCL2, which was originally simply a name added to a function or a gene without known function, involved in the translocation in follicular lymphoma, but John Reed and others were then involved in determining what's the functional role of that otherwise unknown gene, previously unknown gene that is then involved. And his work in particular, after people in Melbourne, and I wasn't involved with them in Melbourne, David Vo in particular showed the normal cellular function of BCL2 in terms of cell survival and that whole field of preventing apoptosis. But John Reed's work was then in the cancer and malignancy space, and particularly around chemo-resistance, that overexpression of BCL2 was a mechanism of overcoming resistance. And at that point, we, I'm being grandiose, Michael Keating, Bill Plunkett, Varsha Gandhi, others were working, and I had the privilege of doing small projects and working under them. So that's when I say we, around looking at fludarabine was an active agent. Michael Keating, Michael Griever had established that. But the real excitement was understanding its mechanism of action, working on synergistic combinations. And one of those that was emerging as a concept was inhibiting or preventing or down-regulating or overcoming BCL2 was predicted to increase the sensitivity and potency of these fludarabine-based combinations. And so very early on, that was identified as a therapeutic target. Now, this was an intricate protein-protein interaction. It wasn't an enzymatic process. It wasn't a cell receptor. It wasn't a DNA replication element. So how could you interfere with it was unachievable. But that concept very early on was strongly established. The first interventional trials that I'd been involved with, again, grew from my time at MD Anderson. So Susan O'Brien was leading clinical trials of an antisense oligonucleotide, oblamersen, the Genesense compound that had been developed in the UK, had shown some activity in follicular lymphoma, and then this was added to the FCR backbone. And in retrospect, modest activity, but at the time a positive trial that improved efficacy. So to me, that proof of principle that targeting BCL2 is an active therapeutic modality in CLL. Now, that oblamersen work was probably around the turn of the century, early 2000s. And in retrospect, it was minimally specific, low potency, difficult to deliver, but that proof of principle was exciting for me. So then being back in Melbourne, and I did a lab-based PhD, not in this domain, but had developed relationships with colleagues at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute who were doing much of the preclinical cell biology work on BCL2 structure and function and interaction with the many, many complex BCL2 family members. And David Huang there, a hematologist, but incredible cellular biologist, was working on understanding the structures that gave specificity to the interactions with the BCL2 family proteins. And he had spent decades with medicinal chemists and then liaising with developmental chemists at AbbVie around these precursor and molecules. And he and a colleague, Andrew Roberts, who also was at Walter and Eliza Hall Institute running his own lab and worked clinically as a hematologist, we then had early discussions about the clinical promise of that, the first AbbVie compound, navitoclax, that Wyndham Wilson had done the first in human phase 1 in broad lymphomas, but our particular intent and focus was that CLL was a very high priority disease for that navitoclax compound, which targeted BCL2, but also BCLXL and some other BCL2 family proteins. And incredible effectiveness. I can still remember individual cases, massive, bulky, chemo-refractory lymphadenopathy, 15, 20 centimetre mesenteric masses. And here, as we got onto venetoclax, probably a real lesson for me. We recognised the potency and saw elements of tumour lysis and recognised the rigour that we would need to monitor for that. That revealed the integral function of BCLXL in platelet survival, another story in itself. And Kylie Mason, hematologist who now works in my department, her entire PhD span out of that and understanding the role of BCLXL in platelet function. But that absolutely proved to me that with a potent and selective BCL2 inhibitor, CLL would be profoundly impacted. And then the venetoclax studies that came from that. So some happenstance, some serendipity, but the critical functional role of BCL2 is probably the theme that runs through all of that.
The other major item that I wanted to take an advantage of because of the meeting was that you organized a panel. I think that you organized a panel with Lydia Scarfo, Sunday afternoon. And it was basically, the title was, do we have to change our definition of what success is in CLL?
Yeah.
Could you share how, first of all, I thought it was a well-conducted and I think well-received panel, but
thank you.
I found myself, I went up to Bill Weird afterwards and I said, I really want those slides. But I'm thinking that whole session should somehow or another be put together in some higher level form.
Yeah.
But I was thinking that you might be the person to say how that panel came to be, how you conceived of that and organized it and put it together.
Okay.
Before you respond, let me switch out this phone. So you have a second to think about your answer.
Sure. That might not be a good thing. Spontaneity tends to be worthwhile.
Well, it'll be almost. Very good. Go ahead.
We're okay? Okay. So the panel.
Yeah, so the panel and really the question or the challenge really, and it's an ongoing challenge, is how do we as a field measure and define success? And probably the fact that question resonates with me and is attributable to Michael Keating. So in the early days of working with Michael, who's an incredibly brilliant, insightful and passionate clinician investigator and advocate, but what has stayed with me and really motivated me was his focus on the patient, their experience, the issues that they're needing to confront and what are they working through, and that continued to motivate and drive him, and that's influenced me profoundly. And many of the initial challenges in CLL, so controlling the disease, diminishing symptoms, prolonging life expectancy, many of those have been achieved, but appropriately and necessarily our patients continue to not focus on how things are better than they were, but the things that are still not perfect. And the cumulative burdens of our treatment, and particularly in the context of the COVID pandemic, and I continued to work directly with patients through all of that. And because of the immune compromise of the disease and the treatments, those patients were profoundly impacted and had a visceral existential threat of major high risk of death from this initially untreatable infection. And as the world has recovered from and come out from that, to a large extent, patients with CLL and patients with immune compromise have been left behind, because issues around vaccination, etc., have enabled us to re-emerge.
And to move on.
Yes, but the lack of efficacy of vaccines in that context mean they're left behind. So those issues around the immune compromise, the burdens of treatment, those goals and how we measure the relative effectiveness of treatment to continue accelerating the field forward are challenges we must overcome and confront. I don't have the answers, but recognizing that we need to acknowledge the massive advances we've made, but we can't be complacent, and we must reorient and engage with our patients and redefine what the remaining barriers to be overcome. And the patient voice in that session was a critical element, and one that I recognised from the audience was very impactful, and that was very encouraging.
How are we doing for time?
20 minutes.
Okay. I'm going to slip in one last question. I think, and thank you for mentioning her first name was Michelle, a journalist.
Michelle Nadine Baker.
Nadine Baker. Fragmented healthcare. I don't know how it is in Australia. It's horrible in the U.S. How do we solve that? I mean, if a patient has 10 prescriptions, and if each prescription is by a different physician or practitioner, they're seeing 10 people. How and a case manager, the insurance companies won't pay for it in the U.S. I don't see how we're going to solve that.
Yes, I certainly can't solve the structures of any health system, let alone the US health system. I think individually and philosophically, one of the things that attracted me to hematology was the enduring and longitudinal commitment and relationship between patients and their doctor. That the privilege of that relationship and the openness and the honesty of that relationship is incredibly fulfilling for me, and I am drawn back to clinical practice, and that replenishes and refreshes me from the rigors of administration, etc. But in that context, and I think Peter Hillman is again one of the physicians who exemplifies this role, that overarching custodian of the journey of our patients is one of the roles in the CLL space, that as primary hematologists for those patients, we can have a major role in guiding that journey. But that's a tiny portion of the total healthcare issues.
Your reference to the long-term relationship warms my heart, because Guntz and Damashek, in their book Leukemia, I think the first edition, Guntz points that out in very clear words, just like you did. So I'm grateful to be reminded of that. On that note, I can't believe that the time has gone so quickly.